This episode of the Crackcast is brought to you by our friends at BigDoor24.pl. It's a new service that not only matches expats with local property experts who speak their language, but it gives you cash-back discounts on successful credit applications. So go to BigDoor24.pl, that's BigDoor24.pl. Find out all the information you need to get the mortgage you want. Again, BigDoor24.pl. Make sure you use the special promo code CRACKCAST to get a great cashback offer. And now, on with the show. So Jo Harper is a journalist for Forbes magazine, where he covers, among other things, Polish political, social, and cultural topics. He's very kindly agreed to join me here on the Crackcast for a chat. Jo Harper, welcome to the show.
Hello, thank you for having me.
My pleasure. So we're going to jump all over the place here, and that's okay, but let me start with a quick question that I'm sure that no one has ever asked you before. How did you first become interested in Poland and Polish affairs?
I started becoming interested in Polish affairs at the age of about 13, 1980, 81. My dad was a probation officer in London, and he used to visit, there's a strange story, but he used to visit prisons in Poland, writing reports for the Home Office in the UK, and I think he started in the late 70s, and this coincided obviously with the uprising in 1980, the strikes, and so on, the beginning of Solidarity and Lech Wałęsa, and we had a lot of, he invited Polish colleagues and friends over from. Probably, I'm not sure. It must have been 78, 79. And we had, I think we had 3 people staying in our house from Poland during that period. And it became, for me, it was just fascination, I guess, from them. From then it stemmed. Then for about a decade, I had no real interest in Poland, followed from a distance. Went to university in the UK. My master's degree was in international relations at Bristol University, and that coincided with the collapse of the Berlin Wall, and suddenly Poland and this part of the world were back on the map, on the news map, and it suddenly became fascinating again. So I kind of reacquainted myself with some of my dad's friends, colleagues. I remember, I think it was for Fiat, I did a report on Poland, not really knowing that much about the history. A cross-cultural examination of Italian-Polish relations. Fiat was building or extending, I think, a factory in Bielsko-Biała in southern Poland. And then after that, I came back to London, came back to the UK, and decided to do a PhD. And I chose Poland as the subject. So I wrote about the Round Table Talks in 1989, and then from there I ended up living in Poland. Got married, and now I have kids. And for a very long time, I haven't been able to leave. So that's my story.
That's a good. We got prisons. We got Fiat. That's a good story, actually. Very good story.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, listen. Let's dive into some deeper water here. I'm going to ask you to make a prediction, which is almost never a good idea in politics, but I'm going to do it anyway. The Polish national elections, about 7 months away, still end of October, beginning of November, something like that. Very long time in the politics of any country, but as things stand right now, based on what we can see now, what are the chances that the current government, led by peace, law, and justice, what are the chances that they lose power in this year's national elections?
My guess is that peace retain a large chunk of its base, whether that whatever that is, 25-30%. Civic Platform, PO, looks like it's within a coalition. Looks like it's gaining some support according to opinion polls. But I guess it's whether or not Peace has a majority. That would be my guess. I think they would probably be the largest party. But question is whether or not they will have to cooperate with smaller parties, and if so, with which ones, and what would that mean in terms of their wider agenda thereafter. But I think my guess is that Peace will be the biggest party.
So loss of majority, maybe. Biggest party, almost certainly, yeah?
I wouldn't say almost certainly, no. I mean, we don't no, nobody knows really, but I don't see Peace's support crumbling. The kind of base 25-30%. I think they're pretty likely to shore that up. So I don't think there'll be a collapse in their vote. The question is whether or not the opposition, the coalition, can cobble together a sufficiently kind of coherent message and give them a run for their money. But we don't really know at the moment what the coalition really stands for. At least I don't. I'm a bit confused as to what they are, other than sort of anti-peace.
Right, exactly. It's early days. Not really a coherent message quite yet.
Yeah, I think so.
You mentioned Platforma there. It's interesting. We've talked before on our show about how Platforma, for the last year, maybe 2, maybe 3, they seem to be just kind of drifting. They're just there. And for a party with about a third of the seats in the lower house of parliament, they seem to have remarkably little traction in the public debate. Nothing to energize nothing to energize their base, besides, as you say, dislike for the other side, right?
Yeah.
No major policy ideas, it seems. So do you think that the founding of the Wiosna Party, of Robert Biedron, is that a sign that someone on the left sees an opening in the weakness of PO?
Well, I think it's a sign that they see an opening. Whether or not an opening exists is another question. Yes, I mean, I think that's quite an interesting development. But again, I think Biedron and Wiosna, I think they have the potential to actually split the opposition vote, if you like. I mean, it may be, if they can stick together, if the coalition can fight on a common platform, they can come up with a common message and a coherent set of policies, then there is potential. I don't think Platforma is particularly interested in what you might call left of centre politics, though. I think that's probably where the schisms will emerge if they do within the coalition. I'm not convinced that Biedron is leftist. I mean, he's obviously socially quite liberal. Appeal to, I guess, sort of urban, more cosmopolitan poles. But then I'm not sure what Platforma stands for. I'm not sure the extent to which they would want to be associated with a grouping that is kind of the antithesis of what that I don't know, 10 to 15% of polls needed to win the election would want. That makes sense.
It does, but could you make the argument that, obviously Wiosna knows that they're not going to bring too many voters over from Peace. They know that. They do know that they're going to bring maybe a substantial number of former PO voters, but could it be that their focus, in terms of building their base, could it be that Wiosna's focus is bringing people into the fold who have not been previously politically active or interested, people who are sick of the bickering and the fighting and largely apolitical, but they're willing to maybe vote for the first time for Wiosna? Couldn't that be a potential source of support?
Yeah, I guess so. I mean, I have absolutely no idea who those people might be. I mean, I guess younger people who maybe haven't voted before.
Exactly.
We're not sure. I mean, it seems the older you get, the more stayed in your voting ways you become.
Oh, definitely. Yeah.
Here, so maybe there's a younger generation of voters, for whom Wiosna will have some kind of appeal, but on their own, they I don't think they have the clout to really to do it. I mean, they're going to have to be in a coalition with PO, and they'll stand together. The question, platform, what it's more. I think it's simpler than that. I think it's what their message will be, rather than a platform, rather than any detailed policies. I think it's just who are they? A little bit like the Democrats in the States. I mean, they're kind of kept together by the fact that they hate Trump. But
right.
There's a big gap between the new left, as it were, the kind of younger generation of Democratic voters, Bernie Sanders people, and so on, and let's say the older, the older Clinton type Democrats, shall we say, who shifted in the 90s, and I think that there's a similar dynamic going on in Poland, probably other countries as well. Do they have a coherent voice, really? Peace has done a big. Sorry.
No, sorry. I'm sorry. Go ahead. I'm sorry to interrupt.
No, I was going to say that Peace has done a very clever job of kind of cobbling together a message that people understand, which has aspects of kind of social democratic, redistributive politics. The 500 plus for
exactly
large families and so on, and it speaks a language of fairness and justice, and obviously in its name. Whether or not that's justified is a different question. But I think in terms of the message, people see it clearly, and they like that. But combined with kind of anti-immigrant, quite defensive, Poland stands on its own against the European Union, and so on. So they've kind of combined two strong elements of a political message that works. Whether or not the opposition can do the same thing and fight on those terrains is, I think, difficult to see it happening. But maybe I'm wrong.
Again, we're still 7 months away from the elections, but going back to Wiosna and Robert Biedron, what is the ceiling that you see them hitting potentially? Where do you see them maxing out in terms of the percentage of the vote?
I don't know. I mean, I would think probably not more than 20%. At tops. If they could get 15, 20%, Platforma 25, 30, then we're talking about potential of having a majority, of a combined majority. But I don't know. I mean, Kukis, in a sense, I think I see Wiosna in a similar kind of vein as Kukis. It's kind of something new, something different. Has a kind of anti-establishment ring about it. Again, whatever that really means. But I don't think that there's a market out there for a big enough market out there for more than 20%. I think 20% would be pretty good going for them.
Yeah, that sounds about right to me as well. You mentioned cookies, and we're talking about Biedron. It's kind of a good introduction to something else I want to ask you about. Let's pivot to something else. Now, I have this theory that I've mentioned several times on our show before, and I want to run this by you. You tell me if there's something to it or if I'm crazy. And if I'm crazy, please go ahead and tell me it's okay. Now, as an outsider, it's interesting to me how often Polish political parties, either explicitly or de facto, are focused around a single personality. Now, these parties can have different levels of popular support, but the common thread is that, again, focused around a single person. This is obviously the case with Wiosna. It applies to some degree to PiS. Of course, Jarosław Kaczyński shared this role with his brother before the Smolensk tragedy. Donald Tusk was Platforma for 7 years. Then there are other examples, as you mentioned, Cookies, Korwin-Mikke. You can go back even further with people like Andrzej Leper or Leszek Balcerowicz. In other words, the man is the party is the man, and so on. Is there something to this, or am I just imagining things?
No, I think that's a good point. It's a very good point. I mean, Platforma. Sorry, there's a car going off. Platforma essentially, after Tusk went to Brussels, started to flounder.
Right.
I think without Jarosław, without Kaczyński, I think PiS would probably start to flounder as well. I'm not quite sure what the reason for that that is. I mean, it may be that Poles have a predilection for strong leaders, or figures that stand out from the party. The party system perhaps is not so well established. There have been quite big changes, obviously, over the last 30 years in party system. The SLD, the left post-communist party, was very 90s, and after 2004 disappeared more or less completely. It's now 5%. I know. I think you have a good point. I'm not sure why. I mean, I could proffer certain theories, I guess, but how helpful they would be.
I'm glad to hear that I'm not crazy. Thanks for that, Joe. I'm glad to hear that I'm not crazy. Excellent. You mentioned Yaroslav Kaczynski, and one day he will either walk out or be carried out of the political scene. It's true. And based on what we've seen over the last 20 years, it's likely that peace will start to lose direction and coherence as well. But on the subject of him, this is another thing I want to ask you about. I'm curious. We all know he's the de facto leader of the party, whatever title he may or may not have. And this gives the opposition, either PO specifically or the left generally, kind of a hammer to beat peace with. He's a controversial figure in the larger public, of course. Love him or hate him. And it kind of seems to me that he could benefit his party a lot by walking away, by retiring and doing whatever he wants to do. I'm not sure if he has any interests outside of politics, but whatever he wants to do, this is the time to do it. It could be a situation of addition by subtraction, and it's just surprising to me that someone hasn't had a word with him and said, "Look, you could do a lot to help our reach, and kind of maybe pull in new voters if you formally, officially stepped away from the party." Do you think there's something to that, and could that help peace if they could kind of gently nudge him towards the door?
Actually, I don't think that's. I don't see it in that way. I mean, I think he's the buckle that holds peace together. I think of peace as a kind of coalition of different interests and different ideologies, and he sort of personifies the contradictions, I think, between them. But does it in such a way that he retains support of the basically the three main groupings are the kind of ultra nationalists, the market reforming post Balcerovich group, and kind of old school peace members, I guess. And he seems to manage. I see him as somebody who demands loyalty from all three groups. I think if he were to step aside, I think peace would probably start to have to think which of those directions, which of those groups would take over. I don't know. I mean, Morawiecki, the Prime Minister, seems to be positioning himself over the last few months. He seemed, his instincts are obviously much more market oriented. The kind of the old guard, sort of nationalist Ziobro characters. I'm not sure the extent to which they would want somebody like Morawiecki to, take over the mantle of peace. I don't know. No, I understand. I think I understand the premise of the question that Kaczynski is somehow
strictly from a PR point of view to kind of a new direction.
Yeah, I see him as the brand. I mean, maybe I'm wrong, but I think peace without Kaczynski is two or three parties at least. If you think about the early 90s when Solidarity fell apart, and there were up to a dozen parties on the right, centre right, and they coalesced into this dichotomy of platform of PO and peace after 2001, and if he were to go, it may be that there would be a fragmentation of the right again.
Let's talk about something that. I'm sorry.
No. Sorry. Go ahead.
Let me ask you about something that Kaczynski loves to talk about, to complain about, to rant about, in fact, and that is foreign ownership and foreign involvement in Poland's media. print, broadcast, etc. Probably radio too, actually. But one of his pet subjects, I think, is this somehow a legitimate issue to raise, or is it a cheap way to get people to take sides in an us versus them debate?
Polish media is very, very conservative. It's or not. I mean, apart from TVN on the TV, Gazeta Wyborcza, print media, maybe a couple of radio stations, I think predominantly the message is still it's still pretty socially conservative. Whether or not that directly supports peace, maybe not. But I don't know. I mean, I spent some time recently writing about Gazeta Wyborcza and talking to people there, and obviously Gazeta and people at the Adam Michnik and others at the top of Gazeta over the years have been the great enemies of Kaczynski and peace, and they're being portrayed as somehow un-Polish, insufficiently patriotic, or something. Soros. George Soros recently bought a stake through one of his funds in Czech Republic, I think, in Agora, which owns Gazeta, and that was portrayed by the conservative media, particularly the state-run media, as another step towards Polish media becoming controlled by international capital or whatever.
Right.
I don't know. I don't see it as in those simple terms. I mean, I think Gazeta stands for a lot of the things that the European Union and kind of standard European politics, particularly in Germany or in France, Britain, maybe not in Britain, given Brexit's going on, but certainly in places like Germany, there it's a kind of standard liberal approach to how a country should be run. Rule of law, democratic accountability, and so on. I think what peace has done is attempt to kind of shift the discourse away from that. So whoever criticizes that, whether they're controlled by international media corporations or not, is going to be an enemy. But I don't know. I mean, I think he has he plays on that probably more than he has the right to.
Seems that way, yeah, it does. Let's turn to your recently published book, Poland's Memory Wars: Essays on Illiberalism. Why memory wars, and what are you suggesting about illiberalism?
Memory wars is to do with the fact that there seem to be two blocks, at least, two main blocks that have emerged again since 1989. I think it all goes back to that period where Polish society has been asked to define itself either in terms of kind of liberal, open, transparent, and European mentality, or one that harks back to a much more kind of exclusivist, kind of quasi-ethno-nationalist Poland, which is closed, which is ethnically homogenous, and so on. And I think you see that you've seen that over the last 25, 30 years in all sorts of ways. If we're talking about the media and other areas, there's been a struggle over what kind of historical memories should be preserved, what should be taught in school, what's acceptable to talk about, how it's acceptable to talk about it. I mean, there are various things. I mean, probably the most vivid example is Jedwabne, which I hope your viewers your listeners know something about.
I imagine many do. I'm sure some don't.
Well, I mean, in a sense, it's about whether or not Poles were complicit or culpable in the murder of Jews during the Second World War. And there were during the SLD governments, the post-communist governments in the late 90s and early 2000s, there was a move towards some kind of collective public apology, acceptance, coming to terms with the fact that Poles' actions during the Second World War weren't exclusively heroic. That doesn't suggest in any way whatsoever that majority of Poles didn't do those things, and that Poles' role during the war was heroic and so on. But there was a need from one side, I think, to accept that certain things didn't fit that narrative.
Right.
And then you have Peace Kaczynski on the other side saying, no, we don't want to apologize. We're not going to say accept that these things are true. It's all about kind of anti-Polish dialogue, narrative coming out of wherever it comes from, those that hate Poland and so on. So the title "Memory Wars" is basically to do with that. It's a Polish equivalent, let's say, of the kind of culture wars that you see in the States and in other parts of the world. Those that want to accept, that bad in the past, and we have to accept that, live with that, come to terms with that, and it doesn't necessarily make us collectively a bad nation, worse than we are. The second part of the question I've now forgotten. Sorry.
Why illiberalism, and what are you suggesting about illiberalism?
Well, the idea that originally was to approach peace from a more sociological perspective rather than a straightforward political one. One of the ideas at the beginning was to examine what do we mean by liberal or liberalism, and do we, when I say we, I mean English-speaking Westerners, whether or not North Americans or Brits or others, and to some extent maybe France and Britain. But I was focused more on the journalists around me in Warsaw and other people that I know, that we seem to define liberalism as whatever we do. The British Westminster model is a kind of epitome of democratic norms and so on. And quite often you'd hear people foreigners talking about Poland as being as if it were a child still learning how to be democratic, and it had its impulses needed to be curbed, and so on. So I thought it kind of necessitated some kind of examination of what liberalism and therefore illiberalism mean. And I think peace, and I think also Fidesz, Orban in Hungary and others, when they talk about illiberalism, what they mean is a return to what they consider to be more traditional liberalism. Going back to before the Second World War, I think that Orban envisages quite a strong patriarchal society in which people know their place. There isn't a great deal of plurality, and whether or not you agree with it, there is a crossover between that version of liberalism and the kind of 19th century version of liberalism that I see in publications like the Economist and the Financial Times, when they point the finger at Poland, for example, breaking constitutional principles and democratic principles, separation of powers, and so on. And I think they hark back. These so-called liberals hark back to a time that they consider to be liberalism. If that sounds like a very complicated way of saying something quite.
That's okay. Well, we're going to put a link to the book in the show notes, of course. Now, for anyone listening, I'm not recommending, but I'm telling you, I'm ordering you. If you're interested in Polish affairs, make sure you find Jo Harper at Forbes. That's Jo Harper at Forbes magazine, and follow his work. I found his articles to be very interesting, very informative, and generally more impressive than most of the news and opinion pieces out there on the subject of Poland and current affairs. Jo, is Forbes the best place to follow your work, or is there a better place?
I write for Deutsche Welle, English service as well, and occasionally for for Politico. But no, Forbes affords a lot more freedom than most other publications that I write for. So if I have the chance, to write something a little bit more interesting, then Forbes is the place. Yeah.
Excellent. Well, Jo, thanks for your time. I really appreciate it, and I'm going to make you promise to come back and do it again sometime.
Okay.
Cheers, Jo. Cheers, Jo. Jo Harper from Forbes, everybody. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next time on the Crackcast.
Thank you. Bye-bye.